Okay, well, I might get started, and keep in mind that we are recording today's session, and each of you will have access to that recording. So if you have a friend that might pop in a little bit late and miss the beginning, feel free, you can have a copy and rewind back. Firstly, a massive thank you for all of those that have made the effort to firstly acquire a ticket and then make the time to come along. Being motivated to step outside the daily norm is more difficult at this time than it's ever been. I speak from first-hand experience in saying that. So thank you for prioritising what I think is an important discussion, and hopefully you get some value from it and walk away with feeling a little bit more comfortable, perhaps, or at ease, or at least a little bit more equipped than you were prior. The premise of MoPA After Dark, for those of you who may have been to an After Dark session at the museum, this is our first online. The premise of MoPA After Dark is quite simple. It's really about connecting everyone here. The room is filled with passionate parents, carers, educators. Special call out to the educators of my children and the panelists' children, who I'm sure a bunch are on the call. And it's about connecting us with the very best resources available to help us raise and educate great kids. I don't profess to be an expert in any of what we're about to talk about today, but what I am pretty good at is asking questions and having questions. Having a little 2- and 5-year-old myself, I was counting up before, actually, the panelists between us have almost a dozen kids, which is a bit scary. So we speak from a pretty unique perspective, in that a lot of the people on this call are very educated and very experienced in their practice, but also we're parents, rather. I was going to say we're kids. Sometimes we're kids. The topics we cover in After Dark are pretty wide and varied. This session was just a no-brainer, but it really covers everything that we are concerned with when we become parents or when we care for children. And lately, like anyone here, a lot of the conversations we're having when we bump into people at the park or have a glass of wine over a Zoom over dinner have been about how we're all coping. It just is a coincidence that we fall on the day that we do with the Are You OK campaign, but quite a relevant connection there, because really a lot of our conversations are about how our friends are doing and also how their children are doing. And in those conversations, we're often left with a lot of unanswered questions. So today really is a fantastic opportunity to connect you guys, the parents that have the questions, the carers, the educators that have the questions, with hopefully a group of people that can help answer them, or at least point us in the right direction, perhaps, to find the answers. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Hannah Beresnicki, who's sitting in the middle of my screen, probably the middle of yours, and actually sitting at MoPA down there in Geelong. Thank you for joining us, Hannah. I introduced you first because you have curated this event, and I just wanted to thank you firstly for all the work you've done behind the scenes. I'll throw to you now to talk a little bit about Deakin SEED and also introduce our panellists.
Sure, thanks, Tom. I'm excited to introduce our panellists from the Centre for Social and Early Emotional Development, or SEED, in the School of Psychology at Deakin University. So SEED is a research and translation centre at Deakin Psychology, and we conduct world-leading research on social development and its origins in early emotional life. Our overall objective at SEED is to promote emotional health from pregnancy through to adulthood and into the next generation. And we are thrilled to be collaborating with MoPA for this event. So thank you for organising this, Tom. So in terms of our panellists, first up we have Professor Peter Endicott. Peter is Associate Head of School in Research and Research Training at the School of Psychology, and he's also Director of the Cognitive Neuroscience Unit in the school. Pete is a clinical psychologist, and he researches the neurobiological basis of autism spectrum disorder. And Pete's interested in how the brain allows us to understand each other's thoughts and emotions, so empathy, and how this develops in childhood, which is really relevant to tonight. Pete was also my PhD supervisor, so he's also the most patient person I know. Secondly, we have Dr. Elizabeth Westrup. Liz is a clinical psychologist and a senior lecturer in the School of Psych at Deakin. Liz is leading a huge research study into how COVID-19 is affecting Australian children, parents and families. And Liz's team has been sampling families every couple of weeks since the pandemic began. And I'm so excited to hear from Liz about the study and what the data is showing on how the pandemic is affecting us in a multitude of areas. And last but not least, we have Associate Professor Jade Sheen. Jade's an academic at Deakin Psychology and a practicing clinical psychologist. Jade works exclusively with kids and their families, and I'm really looking forward to her insights on what impacts of the pandemic she's seeing on the front line and the strategies and suggested resources to support our children and families through this event. On top of this, as Tom spoke about, all our panel members are parents of young kids. So like you, we've been fielding the unique challenges that coronavirus has thrown at us as parents and carers. And we're so excited to bring this event to you to support you during this time. So now Tom will take us through a few really big questions first, but please remember that this is a Q&A session. So we'll encourage you to post any questions that you have via the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen on Zoom. Also know that your mic and your video are muted, so don't stress if you're in your PJs, we can't see you, but we'll definitely be able to read your questions and answer them over the course of tonight. And we've got this incredible panel booked in until 9:30 tonight, so we'll get through as many of your questions as we can. So Tom, did you want to kick us off?
Yeah, thank you. I'll just, Hannah, I'll add quickly any questions that we might not get to. There may be questions that we don't get to, or there may be questions that are a little specific to an individual case. So someone might, in fact, a couple of questions have come through already, and I can see some of which might be relevant for us to connect after the call. And so where we see some themes evolve in the questions that come through, please, if you've got a question, don't be asking yourself whether it's relevant and it fits that criteria. Just put your questions out there. We'll do our best to theme and group those questions together and answer what we can. But also, we will be following up with each of you and helping to distribute any answers to questions we might not get to in this next hour or so. So hopefully that helps clarify how the evening will run. So yes, I'd love to get started. Thank you, Hannah, for the introduction to our panelists. I thought I'd start on a relatively obvious place, and that's about children, and it's about the long-term impact of this extraordinary event on children. We have, lockdowns and masks. We have homeschool. We have playgrounds taped up, which is, quite remarkable. And even my 2-year-old still comments when we walk past. When does the play equipment not have COVID anymore? So, this is quite an extraordinary event. And I think a lot of parents are probably thinking a lot like we are. And that is, what do we think is the long-term impact here? What can we see already might implicate particularly children in the long term? So, Peter, I might throw to you on our first question. From your perspective, what do you think are the likely long-term impacts that the pandemic might have on children specifically?
Look, I think it's a great question, Tom, and it's one that a lot of us have thought a lot about. I guess I'd start by saying that what we know about kids is that they're very resilient, they're very adaptable, and I think it's safe to say that most kids are not going to have major long-lasting traumas or difficulties from this period, but it is a very strange time, and there's a number of things that I think we need to look out for. The other, I guess, part of this that can serve just to put us at ease a little bit is that this is happening to everybody. So if you're concerned about things like education and so forth, to some degree it is a level playing field, although not all kids are going to be affected the same. I mean, we're going to get different issues depending on the individual, but also depending on the child's developmental stage. And I think homeschooling, for instance, homeschooling a prep student versus a grade 4 student, they're very, very different prospects. So look, when it comes to the potential longer term impacts, I guess I think of a few different areas. The main one as a psychologist, I guess we think about is around mental and emotional health. And there's a lot of potential for kids to experience distress around a global pandemic and anxiety around COVID, but also about how the pandemic might be affecting the family, particularly if there's some financial implications, if people have lost jobs. Or there's health implications if people are at greater risk due to pre-existing illness. You might get some kids that experience anxiety around very specific parts of this as well, such as the return to school. And then I think the other aspect of mental health is probably around things like depression and depressive symptoms, but also what we call externalizing behaviours in kids. So sort of hyperactive and oppositional type behaviours might increase in some kids. And we also worry in particular about whether there's an exacerbation of existing conditions, particularly around kids that might have neurodevelopmental challenges. I guess the other part of that is that that the actual household might pose additional risks. You know, there's some households where children are exposed to, you know, things like family and domestic violence, and you know, you don't have those protective factors such as just being able to go to school. So it is going to differ depending on the situation. Some of the other areas I think that we're concerned about are the social areas. So kids have had less opportunity for socialising, for seeing their mates, but also seeing loved family members. So hopefully people have been making use of this technology, but that's certainly something that we worry about. And then there's education, of course. And I think, look, you said it earlier, teachers are doing a fantastic job. They're absolutely doing the best they can, but homeschooling is not the same. I know from my own experience, I'm a terrible homeschool teacher, and I think it's a very different prospect with the kids being at home. So we certainly have concerns about that, but again, it's going to affect kids differently depending on the individual and depending on the developmental stage. The other aspects, I guess, I'm a bit concerned about, but we'll see how they play out, is just the health effects. I think a lot of kids are having more time in front of screens, more sedentary time. Especially, I'm in Melbourne. We have very limited opportunities to get out and about at the moment. So that's a possible risk in the future. But I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I think that, you know, in general, most kids are going to catch up. That it's happening to all kids. And I think the main thing is that we as parents can do things, and hopefully we'll talk about that tonight, but do things to actually support our kids' mental health, and where there are specific concerns or specific needs around children, you know, what's really important is that those kids get the help and the services they need.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. There's Hannah, sorry, I cut you off, I think.
Oh no, I was just going to say I really liked Pete's point there on talking about the protective factors that you know, kids have that help protect them against some of the downsides of what we're experiencing. So I'm looking forward to chatting more about those protective factors and how we can build those around our children during lockdown as we go through the questions there.
Yeah, thanks. A lot of what Pete's touched on, just to give everyone comfort on the call, we'll actually deep dive into a few of these topics that have come up. So that's a really good elevator view, but I would love to kind of dig a bit deeper on a few of them. And some of the questions that have come through already actually have asked us to probe a little bit. So I might throw to you, Jade. Thank you also for joining us. As a psychologist and someone obviously deeply entrenched in family therapy, you're no doubt also seeing really firsthand what challenges are coming about, not just in children, but also in adults and in family units. And so I'm interested if you could help us understand a little bit about some of the broader, what you think the broader longer term implications might be, not just in children, but perhaps in the family unit.
Yeah, look, I've seen this both clinically and through some of the research that we're doing, that families are essentially reporting one of two stories. One of them is that some families are able to reflect on resilience through more time together, resilience through doing activities that they haven't sort of previously done as much, going for bike rides, you know, walking the dog. I'm pretty sure there's some dogs out there that are kind of sick of their owners being home. They've been walked so much. And, you know, there's a lot of those sorts of things coming through, both in the research and in the families I talk to. You know, they are able to reflect on the fact that they've grown to know their child's learning and the way that they approach school and the way that they approach challenges and tasks with a degree of intimacy that they perhaps didn't have previously, because doing homework with your child is very different to homeschooling them. So I think that that's some of the things that are coming through from, you know, some families. But as Pete alluded to, there are also some of those challenges, and those things are coming through as well. And, you know, I guess as a family unit, when there are those additional stresses that Peter's referred to, they are the families that we're really looking to support, and those ones that we're really trying to direct into services early to make sure that they have support both for the young people and probably also for the parents. I think that if you do have health issues, if there is, you know, a risk of family violence, if you do have children with learning difficulties or neurodevelopmental concerns, there are obviously these additional challenges that can pose perhaps additional stresses during this time. And for those families, you know, I think that whilst they might reflect on some of the positives, they're also noticing that this can be an incredibly stressful time. one of the things that I've noted that I think Hannah's put up on the screen there is some contact details for local services that Liz and our colleagues were kind enough to put together. And I think that that's probably one of the first places for those families that are seeking help that I would be looking.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. That is a good resource slide. I'll leave that there for the duration of the event. And if you need some more reference points, feel free to reach out to us. You should have my email with the a link to today's call, and I can connect you to the team here or other relevant resources. Thank you, Jade, for that. I might throw to Liz. I'm fascinated by your research. For those that didn't catch at the beginning Hannah's introduction, Liz is in a really unique position, leading a team that have managed to scramble and get a study together. For those who may want to follow, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, you've got the incredible URL of pandemicstudy.com. Being an ex-marketer, you've done well there. Look, I understand it's really early days, but you are in an incredibly unique position to be seeing firsthand some of the data that's being collected from families. It's real time. It's probably coming into you, I'm sure, on the daily or weekly. Look, I understand it's early days and it's a bit early to call any too many long shots, but I am interested in whether there are any key takeaways or themes presented in the data so far.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So, as you say, right at the beginning of, right at the beginning of lockdown in March, myself and many of our colleagues in SEED and in the School of Psychology at Deakin decided that we really need to do some research and understand what the impact of the pandemic was on families. As all of the speakers tonight have mentioned, families in particular probably hold, unique risks in the pandemic. It's not a normal condition for how we normally raise families. So the COVID-19 Pandemic Adjustment Survey has recruited 2,365 parents from right across Australia. We really tried to get a really nice broad representation of parents in terms of where they live, but also in terms of, their circumstances, their life circumstances, their social circumstances, etc. And the reason for that is because we want to understand how all families are going and not just, a particular suburb in Melbourne, for example. We were really interested in looking at impacts of pandemic and, all the different things that have happened. So some families have lost jobs, some are just really, having to work from home while homeschooling or managing little kids. So we wanted to collect a lot of data on all of those kinds of factors, but also how on asking parents about their own mental health and well-being and their children's functioning too, right across the board: physical activity, screen time, sleep, parents smoking, drinking, you name it, we've probably measured it. And that's because we know that there are probably going to be quite broad impacts. Before I step you through some of our early findings, I just wanted to start by talking a little bit about developmental psychology, because I'm a clinical psychologist, but my research is firmly in development. And I like to wave the flag whenever I can, because the pandemic is really different. We haven't seen anything like this, but actually developmental psychologists have been studying the impact of really stressful extreme events since the beginning of time, although not under the banner of psychology. So, for example, we know quite a lot from the World Wars, how kids and families went through the World Wars, and there are some really famous developmental psychologists looking at that. Some of the key things that we know from that research in terms of the impact of trauma on child development in families is that the frequency and severity of the trauma really matters. So exactly what kids experience. We also, and one of the really important things that I like to share with families is that children who were separated from their parents in World War II, so as probably everyone is aware, some kids were actually shipped out to other parts that weren't affected by the bombing, the daily bombings that London kids were affected by. Those kids actually fared worse The kids in London, you know, they didn't have an easy job either, but they actually did better compared to those who were separated from their family. And that's one thing I just want you to hold on to as I talk about my results. And then the other thing are, what are the protective factors? So we know that the bond in the family is crucial. So the bond with carers, parents' mental health, a shared sense of values, support, and also there's lots of messages about recovery and how we can support families to recover too. So making sure that, you know, when we're at that phase, thinking about getting kids back into routines, reintroducing stability, making sure that they're back into their daily lives. So those themes will play out in how I describe our findings. So far in our research, we've really focused on our data from April. So as I said, we've recruited over 2,000 parents and they completed an online survey in April, and then they've actually, we are very mean and they are incredibly generous. And we've actually called on them to complete surveys every 2 to 4 weeks. And we've now got 9 waves of data. So we just have a lot of information, and you know, in research it takes a wee while to really process that and make sure that we're reporting that accurately, but we will be doing that over the next months. What we do know so far though, in terms of that message around dose and severity, is that is playing out. So, so just overall, when we have compared how kids and parents are going compared to data that's been collected prior to the pandemic and, you know, previous years, we know that they are generally reporting more mental health problems in terms of depression, anxiety and stress. They are reporting lower well-being. This was back in April. Yeah, so that's kind of on average. That's obviously not all parents or all children, but on average, people do seem to be doing worse. What we found was that the dose severity question is important. So there were some pre-existing factors about the families that really made a difference in terms of how likely they were to be struggling when we have surveyed them. A lot of people have talked about how the pandemic has shone a light on inequalities, and that certainly has played out. So those families that were already suffering from deprivation, from money shortages, parents who already had a mental health problem or a significant chronic physical health problem, children with neurodevelopmental disorders such as ADHD or autism spectrum disorder, we know that those families often reported more difficulties. We also, it's not going to be surprising to anyone, but for those families that had some really significant events occur, such as losing a job, having an increase or change in their work hours, also those parents who were really worried and fearful about COVID, all of those things really made a difference. And the last one that I wanted to take note of was that loneliness. Parents who were reporting really high levels of loneliness, regardless of their family situation, even if they were living with their family, that was a key predictor of depression, anxiety, and stress. We also have looked at positive things too, and what we know is that resilience was a strong protective factor against mental health problems. Interestingly, being an extrovert or reporting yourself as having more extroversion was protective. We actually found that our introverts, on average, it wasn't a huge effect, but they tended to report more mental health problems. And we also found that having a supportive partner was all critical, a really, really important factor. A couple of other little findings. We looked at parents and kids in terms of how much they're moving, how much they're sleeping, and how much they're watching screens, you know, TV, etc. We found, really surprisingly, well, maybe, was that parents were moving more. They were actually slightly more physically active, which is excellent. This is back in April. It'll be really interesting to track whether that's still the case now. But both parents and children had more sleep problems. And this is a long-standing finding, and it's why every psychologist will tell you, you know, sleep hygiene, getting your sleep right is crucial. And what we did find was that parents who were moving less and they had sleep problems, that was predicting their mental health. Same with children. Children who had sleep problems, that predicted higher anxiety, depression and irritability in the kids. And it's really that message again, the building blocks need to be in place for good mental health and wellbeing. The last thing I wanted to share was just a really brief sneak peek at our longitudinal findings. We've really mainly focused on the comparing how parents were going in April compared to the pre-pandemic data. But we have begun to look at trajectories over time. So how mental health is going across the pandemic. As everyone on this call will know, things have been very different in Victoria compared to the rest of the country, and that's really played out in our data. In April, we saw that mental health, really was not going so well, but then it improved, it recovered a little bit. But then unfortunately, that sort of mid to late June point where things got worse in Victoria and then kept getting worse, that was really reflected in the Victorian data. So half of our parents are from Victoria, and we really found that mental health seems to have suffered. And we're just waiting to see if that does recover over time.
Thanks, Liz. A lot to take in. I thought I might call out, this is the layman's view and read, but a few kind of themes I'm sensing, and correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like a lot of to kind of sum it up, if I may, a lot of the challenges that might have been present in a family unit, whether it's to do with parents or children, you've seen a little amplification, perhaps. So there's something going on beforehand, or a certain attribute that's almost amplified due to the challenges. And then also the other one I've kind of jotted down here, which is profound for me, was just how important it is as parents that we're keeping strong for the sake of the kids, and that there's a strong correlation between how well the adults and the parents are doing in the family with how well the children are doing. I'm seeing a few nodding heads, especially from you, Jade. Can you maybe support that comment with any input?
I don't think it would be a surprise to most of the parents here to know that as kind of the foundation and the glue of the household, how you're coping definitely has a bearing on how your children cope. They look to you for their sense of safety in the world. And if you're anxious and stressed, then more than likely they're going to be anxious and stressed. And I think that, a lot of parents that I speak to often come in with these comments of, I'll rest and I'll look after myself when my kids are okay. And I'm just going to put this thing on hold. And then when my kids are okay, then I'll do it. And if I had anything to sort of say in terms of encouraging the parents on this call about it, would be try and find some time in amongst this to prioritize yourself, because when you do better, they'll do better. Yeah,
fantastic. And we've touched a little there on some of the things that parents can do. I will come back to coping mechanisms. And also there's a couple of other things that were mentioned in the data there in particular. I want to just capture, because we've got a few questions coming through now, quite a few, and already some themes that I want to give you comfort that we're going to come to. There's been a few questions about sleep, which we might touch on a little bit more. And there's quite a few questions coming through about children that are of the younger age group. Roughly, a few people have asked as young as 2 or 3, up to around that 7 or 8 years old, who are expressing perhaps emotion a bit differently, and there's a bit more aggression, perhaps more resilience, a bit of hitting and yelling and screaming. So it's a kind of it is something I want to come back to and spend some time on, because my wife and I have first-hand experience in this ourselves. We've seen that, and in conversations with parents at the park, it seems to be a very common thread. So I'll come back to that one. Another theme of question here is about babies and socialising. I want to give you comfort that we're going to cover that off in some questioning in a minute. And then also some communication with skills. With kids. There's some interesting comments there about how to talk about some of these things with kids. So I just want to give those people that have asked questions some comfort that we're going to cover some of those points in just a sec. I might throw back to you, Jade, just on that question. We'll cover off now a little bit about how in the younger children, has it been, certainly in, as I said, in our friendship groups, and as it would happen, it looks like it's quite prevalent on the community that's online now. We are seeing a bit more moodiness from the younger kids, aged roughly 2 through to about 7 or 8 years old, than we're used to seeing. And a lot of us are wondering, what's the connection? What's driving this? Is this just my kid, or is this quite common during the pandemic, and what can I do about it? So I know there's a pretty loaded question, sorry, but I'd love to hear feedback on that one.
I think in difficult and potentially traumatic times, children have some fairly typical responses. And as Liz has alluded to, these responses have essentially held true for decades. Pete earlier talked about externalizing and internalizing behaviour. So in my world, externalizing would be some of the tantrums, hitting, kicking that some of your sort of participants have talked about, for example, Emily. And those sorts of behaviours are often common when kids are feeling a degree of unease or a degree of distress. And then we have some of the more internalizing behaviours, and that might typically express itself through poor sleep, separation anxiety, stress or worry about sort of everyday events. In terms of how children typically respond to trauma, often what you'll see is what we would call like a regression. So, for example, my 7-year-old has for a very long time been able to pick her own clothes, get herself dressed and up and get her breakfast in the morning. All of a sudden, she now wants me to make breakfast and she wants me to come and help pick her clothes. Now, we could look at this as a parent and say, well, that's frustrating because I've got other kids to get ready and, you can do this. Or instead, we could kind of step back and say, well, clearly there's a regression, which is an expression of a need. You need me more right now. You're feeling unsure and you want me around. And I think that if we can notice those early bits, sometimes we can avoid some of the escalation of that behaviour that you might see. Similarly, though, I think that if that, that regression comes out in terms of tantrums, meltdowns, hitting, kicking, again, I think that it's a sign that kids are feeling what we would call dysregulated. They're feeling uncertain and they need a really clear and consistent sort of perspective from parents. That combination of kind but firm. They need boundaries around the behaviour because we don't want them going back to school and kicking people. But they also need to have, some empathy when we're delivering that. This sense of things are really tough. And I understand that. And I can sort of hear what you're saying. But it's going to be much easier for us if you can sort of manage that behaviour. And then we can kind of get through it together. So generally speaking, I would suggest that you probably see more regressions. In the groups that I work with, they are the more vulnerable groups that Pete and Liz have talked about, those groups that have neurodevelopmental disorders, eating disorders, and kind of more significant concerns. And in amongst those groups, essentially, we're probably seeing a worsening of their clinical symptoms. But I don't know that that would necessarily sort of fit so much for the rest of the group and your participants here.
So Jade, what you were saying with children sort of perhaps regressing in, having a perhaps temporary regression in their development, would that include sleep as well? We've got a question regarding sleep disturbances in children. So night waking in a child who was previously a sound sleeper, would that sort of fit under that category?
Potentially, I would suggest to you that there's a lot of different reasons why children can have sleep difficulties. It's really interesting in the sense that I had noticed this clinically in all of my patients. And then I went to a presentation with Liz and some of the other group from SEED and actually saw that the data supports it. And so that was an interesting kind of revelation to me as well, to say, okay, so it's not just my group, it's across the board. And we could consider it potentially a regression. For example, children waking up at night and just needing more comfort. And so coming into parents because they need just a little bit more time, a few more cuddles, a little bit more of them. Or potentially we could also see it as a physical kind of outcome of not getting that incidental exercise that we get. Today I was talking to some clients about the fact that when we're at school, we might have to walk up the hill to go to the toilet, or we might have to walk between classrooms and across half a campus to get there. Even though we might be doing formal exercise more, I wonder how much incidental exercise is sacrificed. and whether or not their bodies are as tired as perhaps we might need them to be to get a really good sound night's sleep. I'm seeing some nodding, which is always pleasing. That's good.
Yeah. Definitely fits with my kids, I think.
Yeah, and I think someone touched on earlier, just in some cases, I think, Liz, you said that in some cases a lot of people are moving more than they used to. I can certainly relate to that, and particularly just moving as a family, because you've got your period of time that you can exercise. It's quite a conscious decision, even if it's not go and pump weights at the gym. It's go out as a family and walk and be on the beach or do something together, and so it's a similar kind of, probably for us anyway, volume of exercise, but a very different pattern of behaviour.
I agree, Tom. I think that's true. I do think, though, that was April, and I think since we've had the restrictions, I really agree with Jade. Even reflecting on me, I'm exercising more in terms of the number of times I'm doing a workout, but my incidental movement is way down. And the other thing I was going to say, to add to Jade's, is just the amount of time you're outside. And we know that our circadian rhythm, our body clock, is really affected by sunlight. And so, kids are more likely to be inside because of the restrictions, and more screen time, that can affect it as well.
Yeah, cool. In quite a few of our questions and topics here already, we've covered the need for parents to be strong and be good examples and be patient and be great parents in order for our kids to be great kids. I might throw to you on this one, Pete, about good fundamentals. Because often, when things in life get difficult, whether it's COVID or any other stressful situations, often it comes back to how strong we are as parents and how we can implement those good fundamentals. I know you've got young kids yourself, so you speak from experience also, having working from home and being busy and trying to keep up good parenting. What would you say are the most important fundamentals, perhaps, for us to focus on in order to support our youngsters?
Yeah, we have quite a good literature on what the fundamentals are for mental health, and I think that as we've heard a little bit tonight, it's it can start with you and looking after yourself so that you can be the best parent that you can be for your kids. And I think that this is certainly something I try and live my life according to. There's a lot of distractions in the modern world, and there are some basic fundamentals that you can do for yourself, but also for your kids. And I'm talking about things like eating a good diet, plenty of fresh fruit and vegetables, limiting the junk food, exercise we've talked about, even walking. Even if you can go for a half an hour or an hour walk for the day, it doesn't have to be high impact exercise, but that is really good too if you can do that. Sleep's a big one. Getting enough sleep, consistent sleep as well. So consistent bedtime, consistent waking is really important. Managing your stress, especially at the moment, whatever it is that you do, and there's not one way of doing it. Personally, I meditate for 10 minutes every morning. I go for walks. I listen to music. That works for me, but it's not gonna work for other people. One that is, I think, really relevant to the pandemic is just limit the alcohol use. It's really tempting at the end of the day just to have a couple of drinks, wind down. It's generally not associated with good longer term outcomes. Getting sunlight's important as well. We heard Jade mentioned about circadian rhythms. It's been really nice lately as we're coming into spring, and it's amazing that what it does for your outlook and your mental health, just getting a bit of sunshine. And then I guess the other things are more interpersonal. So connecting with other people, especially if you're feeling quite isolated, feeling lonely. You might be somebody in a single parent situation. Having Zoom meetings with friends, not meetings, but catch up with friends, speaking on the phone, doing whatever you can, making use of this technology that we have. We often can't see one another in person, but there's other things. And I mean, the other thing that we talked about as well is just, it's so important to make some time for yourself and do the things that you enjoy doing. And even if it's 15 minutes a day, you've got to find time for that. If you let that go, it'll really cascade. And the flip side of that as well is that if you're having a hard time, if you're struggling, don't stay silent. Seek help. We've obviously got some numbers up there, but I'm sure we'll come to the other points of the evening. We'll talk about what to do if you are really struggling and where you can get help. And look, I'd say with a lot of those fundamentals, especially around the diet, exercise, sleep, stress management, the socialisation, same for your kids. There's some pretty basic things that I think you can do just to, like I said, be the best parent that you can be for your kids. The other things I think are just making time to have some positive experiences with your kids. I think there's a lot of households where there's high stress, high frustration, and certainly I'm no exception here, but you tend to find yourself having a lot of negative interactions with your kids, and it's really important that you do find time to do something with them that they really enjoy and they get a lot out of, whether it's playing a board game or going to the park with them, kicking the footy, whatever it is. And when you're doing that, make sure you're really engaged with your kids. Don't be distracted, don't be looking at your phone. Give them 100% of your attention when you're doing these things, because that will help forge that connection and give them that that attachment security that we've talked about tonight as well. With homeschooling, I think that a lot of schools have taken this approach, and I certainly take it myself, and that is to focus on the educational fundamentals, so the reading and the writing and the maths. I think in my house, a lot of other things have fallen by the wayside, but that's been the one constant for us and from the school as well. So I think that's important. But ultimately, it's really important for us as parents just to go easy on ourselves. This is a tough situation. A lot of us are our own worst critics, but just give yourself a break. I think we're all doing the best we can, and it doesn't have to be perfect, and you'll make mistakes, but just go easy and realise how difficult the situation is. One last thing I'll say that's not going to be relevant to everybody, but it's just limit your news reading, and social media is the other one that I think can be great. And it can be terrible. Twitter, for example, is a bit of a cesspool, and I think you can go down these really awful rabbit holes with that sort of stuff. So if you're somebody that is finding that you're getting distressed with the 24-hour news cycle and the social media, just step back, because it's like I said, it's great in some respects, but I think it can be dangerous, especially if you're feeling a bit stressed, a bit vulnerable already.
Do you have any specific strategies around limiting your exposure to that, and I guess kids' exposure to that news as well, Pete? Because I know I really struggle with putting down my phone and my mobile screen report saying I'm way up than what I was pre-pandemic. Do you have any specific strategies on that? Because it can be so addictive. Yeah,
and I think that you're right. It does take that addictive quality for a lot of us, and there are elements of the technology that claim to monitor your usage, and I think that's all they do. I don't really think that they help us actually get off our devices. I think you've got to physically remove it from the situation. Don't have the tally on in the background with the news on, for instance, around the kids. I tend not to do that, but just physically remove the media from the situation, so that it's not that temptation, because often it's just it's an impulse, it's a reflex to some degree, and we tend to be really poor at inhibiting that reflex to go for our phone. So I think actually having it removed from the situation, and you might even specify times of day where you say, I'm just going to go put my phone in the drawer and then leave it there. We as a family have done screen detoxes from time to time, where we just take the screens, pack them up in a suitcase for a week. We're pretty unpopular parents those weeks, but gee, it makes a difference. It's fantastic. I think we're due for another one. But that's something else we've done in our household. I don't know if anyone else in this panel has tried that, but that was great. That was really, really useful for the kids.
Yeah, we do screen-free Sundays, Pete. So my kids could tell you, my 4-year-old could tell you what day it is of the week based on whether or not he gets screens. But I think again, even just small things like turning notifications off on social media. There's this idea that we let sometimes our interactions with technology direct our decisions instead of the other way around. If I'm not working, for example, I do not have my email turned on my phone. I have no idea how many emails are sitting in there. And it's only now talking about it that I feel anxious.
I might just further to that, Jade, my follow-up question really off the back of Pete's answer with good fundamentals is admittedly, I'm going to put my hand up and say I'm pretty guilty of just about every bad trait that you've said that is a representative in bad parenting. I'm guilty at different times.
Me too, Tom, don't worry.
And I think probably a lot of people on the phone here are sitting here thinking, yep, you know what, probably had a couple too many beers over these last 6 months or once. Perhaps am spending too much time on the phone. Perhaps am finding myself finding reasons or behaving a little bit not representative of how I wish that I behaved, particularly if you're balancing work, for example, with kids kind of nagging you and you're like, well, I normally wouldn't flick the TV on, but I will. Or, you know, just wishing for that little minute of solace and isolation for myself. It sounds a bit weird when we're all isolated that you want more of it, but I think the missing part is time for yourself. And so I'm interested in whether you've seen a bit of that come through and what your advice would be when, you know, I've got the 2 kids and my lovely wife, and we all are locked in these 4 walls. It's impossible to find a room in the house where you're not going to get nagged for more than 5 or 10 minutes. What would you say, you know, top few pieces of advice for getting that time away just to process this stuff that we need to work through in our heads?
Look, even in Melbourne, in our stage 4 lockdown, we are able to get out and exercise for an hour a day. And so I might try and keep some of that time in the backyard for my kids, but I get out and walk with a friend for my hour. And my husband does the same. We do take our hour separately some days just to get out of the house and away. This is perhaps a less popular kind of recommendation, but I also have noise cancelling headphones. And with 4 children, you know, I have to say that Bose is officially, you know, my favourite company, and I just want to give a silent plug because there are times when it would be really tricky to exist amongst the arguing without it. But I think that the key thing to that, though, is that when I do it, I do say to them, guys, I really care about what you're doing, but I feel like I need some time out. And so I'm going to turn these on, and for the next half an hour, Mum's going to have some time out, but then I'm going to come back. And I think that just that conversation about flagging it, telling them what I'm doing for my own self-care, modeling that behaviour, and not having them anxious because Mum's just disconnected from me, but instead knowing the hows and the whys. I think just closing that loop can sometimes make that a positive experience as opposed to a dismissive one. And then I think just engaging wherever possible in your usual activities. I play the drums, and so thankfully you can't really hear the kids when you're playing the drums. But outside of that, I'm really missing music, and I kind of have visions of sitting outside with my radio up in the backyard pretending that I'm at a concert. You know, so I'm going to find ways over the summer, I think, to try and compromise, to try and do whatever is needed to try and find those little bits of me time and connect with the things I really love. I think for me, that's probably a part of it. And for the other parents I've spoken to, certainly that taking time out, walking by themselves, doing yoga with a friend in the park, those things that are allowable, but probably dismissed because we all feel like we can't leave the kids or we shouldn't.
Yeah. I'm quite a stubborn person, to say. My wife will laugh when I say that, but I've never been a walker. You know, I'm a bit of a skeptic when it comes to a lot of things, and it was only recently that I've started doing just a lap around the block by myself. And it's not until my wife said, just do it, just go, because I say, oh, what am I going to get out of that? But honestly, I can say that, yeah, this is new to me. I used to have a lot of me time in commuting and all sorts of other things. I didn't realise how much I valued just some time, just 10 minutes. So, yeah, hard for a bloke to say, hey, I want to go for a walk. It doesn't sound like a very manly thing to do, but it's been very beneficial for me anyway. I might change track a little bit. There's some really great questions here, and we're going to cover this topic anyway. I'd like to quiz Liz on something specific here, and that is about younger children. So we've got a few questions there, and I've also have a little 2-year-old. And I can also say when we actually opened MoPA between the 2 lockdowns, some of you on the call will have hopefully made it in for the 8 weeks that we were open. It was a busy time because I think everyone was pretty keen to get out. And I was speaking to a lot of parents of very young children, and there was a really common theme, and that was, my child is, say, less than 24 months old. And so by the end of this, at least 25% of their life has been spent in isolation with one or two people around. Firstly, what do we think the impact of that lack of socialisation has been on these really young kids who have spent a good portion of their lives in a very unusual environment? And then secondly, what perhaps advice or tips, I might open then up to the rest of the panel after, Liz, you've talked a little bit about maybe what you've seen in the data specific to younger kids, and what, whether there's concerns, is that a consistent concern amongst parents? And then I might, as I say, open up the panel for a chat about that.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So I'm a child and adolescent specialist, clinical psych, and so have quite a bit of experience working with kids and bubbers as well. And one of the things that I think a bit of a misconception about littlies, like really, babies and toddlers, is that they need a lot of input and a lot of stimulation. They don't. Their world, looking at their hand, looking at shadows, and as they grow and learn how to, flex their body and roll over, etc., all of those things hold just so much entertainment for kids. And so actually, I'm not at all worried about the babies and little toddlers. Really, they actually don't need a lot of peer interaction or interaction with other kids. The most important bond for them is with their caregivers. It doesn't mean that kids who have siblings running around, that they're not also getting a lot from that. But if parents just have one child and it's a little bubba under a year old, or a little toddler, I just don't have any concerns about it. Again, though, the theme that comes up again and again in our research and in prior research, some of my colleagues at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute at the Children's Hospital, the Maternal and Child Health Study, they've done a beautiful research following a cohort of Victorians, mothers. And I just wanted to come back to the point that we've all really touched on, but it's the oxygen mask. Getting time away from your children actually is better for your children's outcomes. So it actually predicts better, it is associated with better well-being and mental health in your children in the long term. So that's just a plug there. So the thing that I would really recommend for parents of infants and of toddlers is just take a break. You do not have to entertain your child around the clock. You do not have to try and compensate for the fact that they're not going to childcare or seeing their grandparents. Just relax. And encouraging independent play, and even from infants, is actually important. And as I say, they are so very entertained by the natural world. I have more concerns about older kids who already have strong relationships with their friends and with their grandparents, etc. But what we know is that kids are incredibly resilient. And if the one message I hope all of our parents on the call take away tonight, it's I think the kids will bounce back as long as we bounce back, and as long as we're taking care of ourselves. So that would be my one really key message.
Thanks, Liz. Anyone else on the panel just want to talk about younger kids in particular, perhaps in whether it's research or in practice? Because there seems to be quite a bit of an emphasis, not only in our questions tonight, but in general conversations. Is there any validity to this concern that younger kids have spent a long time not seeing people, and there's a perception that perhaps they're going to struggle with their early socialisation, whether it's when we come out of lockdown and suddenly there's busy streets and there's people walking around, the environment is busier. Has anyone got any thoughts on whether that is a very real concern, or do we echo Liz's sentiment that the younger kids are actually lesser of a concern than the older kids who have established social networks they've been away from for some time?
It was nice to hear Liz mention all of those factors. I certainly agree. I think the other thing that we need to just take into account is that feels like a really long time. I understand that, but it hasn't been that long. We're not talking about, you know, years and years without being able to see friends and family and grandparents. It has been a few months, and certainly it's been longer in Melbourne, but I think that we'll get out of this pretty soon, certainly in Melbourne, and you know, we'll gradually get back. I don't think it's going to be too much of a shock to the system for the kids either, because it will be a gradual return to the normal activities, and we'll look back and say 2020 was enormously disrupted, but it wasn't 12 months of you know, stay in your house and have constant disruption. So I think we just need to sort of, I guess, differentiate between how long it's actually been and how long it feels like at the moment.
Do you think, perhaps I'll pop this to Liz, like we've got a question regarding little ones, like sort of up to 1-year-olds being at home for a lot of lockdown, and then perhaps when they do go out to childcare or they see other people, do you think that will have an effect on increasing separation anxiety? Or do you think, as Pete said, with the gradual return to regular life, that won't be such an issue?
Yeah, look, starting in a new environment, whether it's starting, you know, childcare or starting at school, that always is an adjustment period for all kids. And there's lots of individual differences in terms of how kids respond. So some kids, it's as though they've always been there on the first day, you know, they're almost running. Other kids need a lot of support through any adjustment. And I guess I would say, you know, for kids that had started childcare, but then the pandemic happened and then it didn't, you know, continue, or similarly kids who started prep and then have really been at home most of the year. Yeah, you have to think about it as though they're starting again afresh, and you would need to put all of those the things in place. So in your own head, thinking this child may need a bit of extra support. Yeah.
Any specific thoughts on masks? I know that's a topic, again, one of the park chats that we have with the parents we bump into, particularly with little ones. We know from I was just before the call in the hours and lead up to this evening, I did a little research because I remember reading an article about how body language and the perception of body language is particularly amongst between a mother, for example, and child, how important it was that mum indicates to child what's okay with a smile and what's not with a frown and that type of thing. Is there any specific thoughts that anyone on the panel has about the impact of us mask wearing? Because it looks like this could be, particularly in Victoria, the norm for a more extended period.
Yeah, that's a good question, Tom. I think most kids, the majority of their day will be spent inside when parents don't have a mask. So from that perspective, I'm not too worried. But if yeah, look, I don't know what Jade and Pete think, but if there is a different circumstance, then yeah, that could be a consideration. I would definitely, with a young kid, have a lot of, make sure that a lot of the day is without a mask.
We do a lot of work at Deakin actually on what we call facial emotion recognition, which is the ability to extract information from her face to determine what they're feeling in particular. And certainly the eye region is a really key component when it comes to extracting that information. But I agree. I'm not concerned about this from the kids' point of view. I think that most of the time they'll be at home, they'll be around people that are not wearing masks. But I think it's certainly created a level of awkwardness for most adults walking around in the community. I typically, I'll walk past somebody and smile at them, and you can't really do that obviously anymore. So I just tend to avoid eye contact. So it certainly has changed things for adults, but it's something else to get used to. But I'm certainly not concerned about that. And obviously the mask wearing is pretty important, especially for Melbourne at the moment.
Yeah.
Could I also add to that, Pete and Liz? I agree with both of what you've said. I now, in my clinical practice with young people, have to wear a mask, and in fact, protective eyewear when I'm working clinically. And I really struggled with that. I think that connection that you have with your clients and their ability to read you and you read them back, I think a real grief and a loss around that in particular. And yet it's been really interesting to me to see how readily kids have adapted to it. And I have been checking in in fact, some kids with autism I work with, there is kind of that special provision for them to not have to wear masks, and yet the majority are and are doing okay with it. So I think that some of those fears that I walked in with are not being echoed in the young people that I'm working with, and I'm asking regularly. So that I think was particularly interesting. It was actually me that struggled more.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Sorry to deep dive on that particular topic, but I know it's probably top of mind for a lot of people. We've touched a little bit on some of the behaviours we're seeing, and in a sense, we've kind of downplayed it by discussing the fact that our kids are very resilient, and that if they'll bounce back if we bounce back. I'm interested just for a second to touch on perhaps some of the things that we might be observing. There might be some people on the call, for example, that have joined for a specific reason. There's a concern, they're seeing something in their kids, and they're still worried. Look, it doesn't feel normal. I'm more concerned about this than what we've said tonight hasn't put their minds at ease. Can I throw to you, Pete, on this one and ask a little bit about some of the things that we can be on the lookout for that you'd consider to be cause for concern above and beyond talking about it in a forum like this?
Yeah, and we can consider this from the point of view of our kids, but also our partners and the other adults around us, because there are things that we can be on the lookout for that might indicate that things aren't great from a mental health perspective. And I think ultimately the one thing that we probably look out for more than anything else is changes in behaviour, changes in the way that people conduct themselves, changes in the way that they keep routines. We've talked a bit about sleep, we've talked about behaviours, but that's that's often what we're on the lookout for, and that's usually the first indication that there might be something going on. It's different in adults and kids. It's different from one person to the next. I think it's different in males and females as well, and we're often concerned in particular about things like depression and anxiety. And so the sorts of things we're looking for there are, sadness, crying, but also irritability, anger. As I mentioned, we're looking for changes in sleeping patterns, sleeping more, sleeping less, waking up, difficulty falling asleep and staying asleep, changes in eating, and again, it can be eating more, eating less. The other things are things like withdrawing, if somebody's withdrawing from others in particular. There's something called anhedonia, which is often a feature of serious mental ill health, which is just a lack of enjoyment in the things that somebody used to enjoy. So if you're seeing that can be a concern. We're also looking out for things like reductions in energy, difficulty in concentrating, and just more negative thinking and negative biases, sort of always seeing the glass as half empty. If all of these things are sort of major changes from the usual, that's often the indication that something might be going on. I think what's important, whether it's with a partner or with your kids, it's about communication and talking about how you feel and making sure that you're having open conversations and that you create an environment both for your partner and for your kids where it's expected that you will discuss emotions and you're comfortable actually discussing the way that you feel. I noticed there was a question around, how do you discuss the pandemic with your kids? And I think it differs depending on the developmental stage. But I think that, you've got to be honest with your kids about what's going on and really reassure them. It's not about making them worried and focusing on all the negatives. It's just about saying, okay, we're in this situation where we're having to lock down for these reasons, and it's to protect us. And we're going to get through this, and we're going to come out on the other side, and it's going to be okay. So I think that's a big aspect of it. What we talked about a little bit earlier is that those that have got pre-existing mental health difficulties are going to be the most at risk there. So if you whether it's in kids with mental health difficulties, whether it's a partner with a history of depression, anxiety, I mean, these are the individuals that are probably most at risk of experiencing mental ill health during during this period. Look, there's lots of good resources out there if you do feel that that you need to get help for yourself or for somebody else, especially if you're wanting to get help from a psychologist. But I think that for most people, the first port of call is your GP. Whether it is for yourself, whether it's for a partner or a child, and you can get a mental health treatment plan done with your GP, and you can access Medicare funded psychology sessions, 6 in the first instance, and that can go out to I think 10 with a review. But your GP is also going to be able to help with other treatment options, but also with referral to a specialist if it's that serious, and whether that's referring to a developmental paediatrician or a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I think a GP in most instances is a really great starting point if your level of concern is that great about your own mental health or about the mental health of a partner or your kids.
Terrific. Thanks, Pete. Thank you very much. Liz, on perhaps a slightly lighter note as we come towards the back end of our allotted time, we touched a little bit on some of the silver lining, and I'm keen to explore that with the entire panel in understanding, what positives can we take away? What's the data saying? We touched on some of the families that are perhaps physically a bit more active. I am sure that I'm not alone in saying that some of my family relationships, are probably stronger than they've ever been. And I think that's because of the time that we've got, and we're not so busy flogging ourselves at work and commuting and just running a million miles out to keep up with life, because life has slowed down. And that's just my personal example. I'm sure there's lots in the data. What would you say that the key themes of positive outcomes? Where's the silver lining, if you like, in the data?
I'm going to cheat and tell you some of the quotes from our research study. So we've asked parents what the impact of the pandemic was on their family. And I'm just going to read a couple of quotes, but I'm going to warn you that I'm going to start with the negative. And there's just such a strong variability in parents' experiences. And I just wanted to reflect that. I think it's always important to remember that some people are really struggling. So one parent said, the children's mental health has significantly suffered. 7-year-old cries herself to sleep most nights. 5-year-old has become very aggressive towards her sisters and so that was a mother of 3 children. Struggle with 2 school kids and 2 toddlers, too much work, too exhausted, stressed, mentally draining, physically exhausting. Sometimes I get depressed, worried if me or partner might catch the virus, can't sleep at night. There's a mother of 4 children. Most days I now miss meals so the children, can eat. It's clearly someone affected financially, and that was a mother of 2 children. Now to the more positive examples. I think it's helped improve work-life balance. I get to spend more time with the kids, and I spend more time with my children, which is awesome. As a father of 2 children. It's actually improved our relationships as we've got time to work through issues, mother of 3 children. We mostly stay at home and play in the back or front yard. We also play games inside, cook or clean or tidy up mess. We've used the time inside to rearrange the home and do a spring clean. That's a mother of 3 children. Yeah, so really varied experiences. And I think, I agree with you, Tom, I can definitely reflect on some positives as well in terms of spending more time, not having to commute to work.
Mm. Yeah, so that's a huge spectrum, isn't it? Important to remember there's 2 ends to it, for sure. And I think even in some of the, perhaps in the negative commentary, you might find there are some positives, and similarly where there's lots of positive outcomes, for us personally, from our experience as well. There's lots of difficulties. So it's funny. I don't think everyone I speak to, no one's singing from the rafters about how great this period is. That's for sure. Everyone's going through a degree of difficulty, if you like.
Look, I would say some parents have kind of said, oh, I don't know if I should keep going in the study because we're actually fine. We haven't really been that affected. So there's not a small, there is definitely a substantial number of parents saying that. So yeah, like I agree. I don't think it's, it's just that it's really variable, I think.
Yeah.
I think for a lot of perhaps parents and children too. It's the lack of control and the unpredictability of what has happened and what is still in front of us with as we come out of this pandemic. Do you have any tips, anyone in the panel, on how to increase or how to focus, how to improve our perceived sense of control in ourselves and also in our children?
I'll have the first go at that, Hannah, if that's okay with the panel. I was kind of thinking a couple of things when you're talking about that lack of control. The first one is that I think that initially in that first lockdown, we thought it was going to be short-lived. And then we kind of went back into lockdown, and it's ended up being a much longer period of time than perhaps we anticipated. And I think that as a result of the fluctuating nature of this, we haven't necessarily put in supports that we might necessarily do. So what I mean by that is this: if you were living on a remote farming station in the middle of the outback, what are the things that you would put in place for yourself and for your kids to connect them to the outside world? How would they do their ballet classes? How would they talk to friends? I think that at the moment we keep just waiting for this to stop. And as a result, we potentially are putting on pause things that we could already be actioning in the anticipation of it stopping. And so one of the things that I would be thinking about is just trying to encourage people to action whatever you can with, the hope that it's over soon, but the expectation that it might be variable. And so trying to do actually everything that we can and don't put those things on pause. In terms of that question of control, an activity that interestingly I kind of saw on the news, but I've been doing with my clients for quite a while, is to draw a bullseye. So in the center circle, identifying all of the things that you can control, and in the external circle, writing down all of the things that you can't control. And what you'll find is that over this time, there's probably going to be some movement between the circles. Some of the things that used to be in the center are going to move to the outside. But by really being able to articulate what are the things that you can control, instead of worrying about the things externally, you can start to really just focus in on a few things that you can do. And sometimes that alone gives us a sense of purpose. And purpose gives us a sense of autonomy and control, which is really important for mental health.
And would that
Two very small tips.
Yeah, would that activity translate to children as well?
Absolutely.
Bullseye?
Absolutely. My poor clients have had to do it for the last weeks.
Just in terms of kids as well, I always find another really helpful one. Kids often struggle, well, some kids more than others, that they don't have a lot of control over much of their life. And so we often encourage parents to give them some sense of control, in making choices day to day. So, that could be a young toddler choosing what they'll wear or the plate that they choose, and older kids, obviously more substantial. One thing that I often have done with my clients is, role play, switching roles, so that just in a game format, kids get a chance to boss parents around a bit. It can be really refreshing because particularly if kids are at home with their parents all day, they're not at school, they don't get the chance to be with their peers for an hour and not get bossed around. It can be really nice for them just to, shrug that off and have a sense of control even for a brief game.
Amazing. Look, I wanted to touch lastly perhaps on, there's a couple of things here. We've got some questions. I might, Hannah, if you want to have a look through and see where we're at with our incoming questions, I'll throw to you and I'll give you some seconds to collect your thoughts on the questions that have come in before, whilst we talk briefly about looking forward. We've kind of organically moved the conversation there, but I'm really interested just unpicking a little bit about preparing kids for that uncertainty. And perhaps the answer is exactly what we've just talked about, which is to learn what we can and cannot control, perhaps, and focus on what we can. But just to unpick it a little bit more, it looks like, certainly in Victoria at least, uncertainty is the new norm. And that's you know, for someone, I can speak from my own personal experience. I am a control freak. My wife will laugh when I say that, in admitting that. But yeah, I like to know what's coming up, and I like to have pretty clear expectations about what the future looks like, so that I can steer my decisions and my behaviours towards them. But at the moment, we have very little of that. In a world where perhaps there's little of that for some period of time to come, even for parents, do you have any more advice, or would you just echo what we just talked about in answering that question, which is, you know, in summary, how do we approach the future when we don't know what the future looks like?
Do we ever know what the future looks like? I think that we hope for the best. We dream and we plan, and there are things that you can still do. There are things that, you know, no amount of travel restriction can regulate. I've been planning a holiday that was going to happen next year, and now it's probably pushed out for many years, but that's okay. I'm still planning. I'm still dreaming. I'm still practicing my language. I'm ready to go. Like, you know, when that ticket booth opens, I'm there. I think that planning process in itself has been therapeutic, to know that it won't be forever. So I can't tell you how long it will be.
Is there a way, Jade, we've had a question from Mark about how to sort of communicate to our kids about coronavirus and about the uncertainty around coronavirus. And I think you had some really great points then. Do you have any tips on how to relay that kind of vibe, that attitude, that feeling of hope to our kids, hope during uncertainty?
It could be as simple as dinner time conversations. You know, I mean, often the favourite one in our dinner table is, if you're a superhero, which one would you be? But, you know, outside of that, it might be, where's a place that you want to travel? You know, research it before the next dinner and tell me about it. You know, we could possibly put it on our list. It's kind of like when kids go into the store and you tell them, oh, put it on your Christmas list. And it's this ever-growing kind of Christmas list for later. They're actually pretty good at imagining forward, at dreaming. And so you can find lots of opportunities to do that, to talk about what they're most looking forward to when they go back, rather than just shutting down those conversations because, oh, we don't know when it's going to happen or if. I think just opening up to those conversations and encouraging it even kind of conveys a sense of hope. Outside of that, talking to kids about COVID, I think that Pete has sort of addressed that really well, which is to say, be honest with them. You know, I think as scientists, we're probably more data-driven, find comfort in data. And so I would give kids developmentally appropriate information, but information nonetheless. A really simple example, I work with a client whose parent works in a COVID ward. She is currently very anxious about that and about her risk to her parent. So we got her mum to film herself going in and putting on her PPE. And so she could see that whole process, all the steps. And you know what she said after 10 minutes of doing it? Oh my goodness, I'm bored. But I feel much better.
Can I just add to that? This might sound like a really obvious point, but just try to answer your kids' questions. Like Jade said, don't shut them down. I know with my kids, and today I was on a walk with my youngest, and there's just, you know, they've got so many questions about this. It's new for them as well, and just do your best to answer them as honestly as you can, but just always be seeking to reassure them. You know, this is serious. It's not the end of the world, though. You know, we will get back to something that looks a lot like what it looked like before. So to just do your absolute best to answer the questions rather than deflecting and letting kids just ruminate on their concerns around this. Just try and put their minds at ease as much as you possibly can.
Yeah, those are great tips. Sorry, Tom.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's a couple of questions here that talk about and mention the word guilt. Wouldn't mind just spending a couple minutes. We've got until 9:30, so we've got about 10 minutes left, and I think we've covered most of the key themes here, but I did want to touch on this one, which is this notion of guilt. And it might be the guilt that we feel when we tell our kids to sit down and shut up because dad's got to work. Or it might be the type of guilt around the fact that you're asking your partner for some time to say, look, can you just take the kids off me? I had a moment the other day. I lost my temper. And my beautiful wife said, look, I think Dad needs a couple of minutes. We're going to go to the park. But you still feel guilty. You know, we all feel guilt because we think that, you know, we should be stronger and more resilient. On this topic of guilt, has anyone got any advice about how to manage that in ourselves when we're the type of people that like to think that we're strong and we can do this, and that we feel guilty for asking for some time from our kids or from our partner? Has anyone got any specific thoughts? Liz, you've unmuted. Perhaps you could share your thoughts.
Yeah, Tom, I think I was just trying to think of what the start point is. Definitely becoming pregnant, possibly prior to becoming pregnant, was the introduction to parent guilt. And it's quite a big introduction, isn't it? I think most people can relate to that. I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and I suspect other panel members might be too. And so we have really high expectations of ourselves as parents. And you can only shatter them, really, can't you? Yeah, look, I think it's just coming back to that core message that we have to be kind to ourselves, because, you know, feeling guilty and like we're just doing a crap job isn't actually going to help. It is a pandemic. It's pretty dire circumstances. Yes, we can tell our kids that we're probably going to be okay, but actually it's really tough. And we have to remember that. One of the things, you know, when we're thinking about recommendations from our data and writing up the COVID study, one of the things we've really talked about a lot is, now we've got guidelines from prior to the pandemic around things like screen time. Do we think it's appropriate that parents follow those guidelines in these times? And our answer is no, it's not really. Because if you've got parents that have to work, if you've got kids who can only go out for 1 hour a day, if they don't have a backyard, etc., then no, it's you know, probably we're going to have to be flexible on some things. Our really strong recommendation is to know what the building blocks of good health are, and we've mentioned all of those. So that's sleep, nutrition, physical activity, a connection, social connection, cognitive stimulation, so reading books, etc. So if those things are in place, then we can relax about some of the other bits that we would have been more stressed about prior to the pandemic. Yeah, we have to give ourselves a break. And the other thing I would say is keep telling yourself, it's science. If I'm going okay and I get a break, my kids are going to be better. And it should be a mantra that you repeat to yourself.
I agree, Liz. I mean, I was raised Catholic. I could speak this whole seminar on guilt if you wanted me to. But I think that if you're really struggling, I agree with everything that you said. If you're really struggling, I mean, psychologists often talk about a cognitive reframing. And I think just to touch on what you said there, Liz, if you really can't let go of that guilt, look at it as something that you're doing for other people. You know, you're taking this time out, not for you. You're taking this time out so that you can be a better person for them. So you sort of flip it around if you really struggle with it. But you shouldn't feel guilt over it. You're absolutely you know, it's a right that you have to have some time to yourself and to do things that you enjoy. But yeah, if you're really struggling, just reframe it and know that you're doing a good thing for those around you, not just for yourself.
And Jade, I think it was, spoke about how to frame that to our kids as well, saying, mummy needs a little bit of time to herself. Pop those noise cancelling headphones on, or go make a cup of tea, do what you need to do. And like Jade said, just let them know, and let them know that you'll be back when you'll be back, and you'll be ready to go on with them then. Is that, I paraphrase you terribly, Jade, but we just had another question about it, so I wanted to cover it.
Yeah, no, I think you've got it. You know, one of my sort of favourite authors, Winnicott, talks about the good enough mother, and I'm going to extend that to the good enough parent. You don't have to be perfect, you just have to be good enough. You know, good enough can be 7 minutes of unencumbered face-to-face time with your kid per day, per child. You know, it could mean a lot of things, and we put so much pressure on ourselves, whether it be around screen time or the perfect transition to school or whatever it is, without considering that these things are not all created equal. Not all screen time is the same. There are plenty of things on screens that actually build networks in the brain and actually help kids to learn. not all experiences are the same. And I'm going to finish off with a comment from one of your listeners, which says, what about play? I agree. There is so much opportunity and time now for play, and it's something that definitely is a fantastic building block to learning. And so all those people that are anxious about school, I keep going back to 100 years ago. Schools did not look the same. We did not always educate children the same ways, and yet there have been plenty of generations of very learned people. I think that education is all around us. It's through play, it's through cooking, it's through opportunities to talk about the clouds as you go on your walk in the afternoon. So again, with that sort of echoing of be good enough, open up opportunities for lots of different types of learning, and all of those things will be of benefit.
Thanks, Jade. We are coming to the end of our 90 minutes, but it is entirely appropriate. Someone's asked a question. I'll say first name. Abby has asked what a remarkable question, and perhaps we ask it semi-rhetorically because it's a difficult one to answer, and it's a really it's probably a thinking point for us all to go away with more than a question. I love it. So I'm going to read it because I probably couldn't paraphrase it better than Abby's written it. She said, we have found COVID lockdowns and all of the unpleasant emotions of grief, uncertainty and sadness have led us organically down a path of gratitude and realising what is most important to us, our health, happiness, nature and quality time with friends and family. When the lockdowns ease, what are some tips to ensure that we keep these values high in our sights without getting caught up in the rush of life again? How well, how perfectly phrased. Why don't we just give each of the panelists an opportunity to give us an answer as good as the question?
I'll go first on this one, Tom, because pre-pandemic, I finished my PhD and just wrote myself off so much, and my family with it, and we had to stop, we had to regroup, we had to think, together, think about what we wanted our lives to be like. We had to, we designed a family mission statement, asked the kids of, what they wanted the family to be like and what our goals were as a family, and that's really helped us not, to design our lives around that and not to get caught up in the rush of life. So that might be something that you could try.
That's such a great question. There's, I guess, one way that I go about it, and I've had some tough health times in the past, and this has been a real problem for me, is going back to normal life, and retaining that gratitude has been really challenging. And for me, it's been the mindfulness meditation practice that encourages self-reflection and what they call living an examined life. For me, that's been probably the best thing to sort of always take me back to difficult times where you sort of say, well, remember back then when you didn't know if there was a tomorrow. How did you feel? And just trying to not be consumed by it, but just trying to remember the learnings from difficult experiences. I think that for me has been the best thing that I can do to try and keep that gratitude in mind, because it's such a great point you raised, and we haven't really talked much about gratitude tonight, but it's a really important part of our lives.
For children, often we talk about something called a victory jar, where when we have successes, we write them down, and on the other side of the paper, we write down what helped us get there, and you put it in a jar, and during tough times, you kind of go back through. So that sort of concept can translate both through the mindfulness that Pete's kind of suggested and that mission statement that Hannah's talked about, to even sort of other avenues that you yourselves find to be useful, whether it be journaling or writing music or creating art, finding a way to kind of have a living record or a document of what it is that you took from this time, so that you can go back and you can reflect when you feel like you've moved away from it.
I would just add that we talk a lot about, having goals in life, but we don't always think about our values. And, you know, goals are something that's always in the future. Values are what we live right now. And I think for some people, what this experience has revealed is touching base with our values of, you know, being in nature or spending more time connecting with our family, our children, whatever that might be, spending more time washing dishes because we now have to cook so much more. Just kidding. Yeah, and I think it has to be structural changes, otherwise they won't stick. So I agree with the others, you know, putting in place, you know, whatever it is, you know, dedicating some days to XYZ and telling people and making it happen.
Amazing. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panel again for making yourselves available for the same reasons. It's difficult for us all to be here. I really do appreciate it. I know I certainly feel comforted by the fact that, you know, we've always said all along in politics and in society that we are in this together. But it certainly, when we have discussions like this, it just helps us, I think, connect with each other and see that everyone's sharing these challenges. It is a degree of difficulty. No one has it easy, but also that there's brilliant minds like yourselves and amazing resources available to us if we need them. So a final thank you to all of you who attended this evening and made the effort to be here as well. We thank you for your support, and we can't wait to see you back at MoPA for a big play, a good coffee, and some relaxing times on the other side of this, albeit probably in a mask for some time yet. So thanks again. Thanks for joining us. It was a fantastic discussion. I've enjoyed it very much, and I hope everyone else did too.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Night.